This meeting ends one way, Ho. Everyone signs today.
I can't sign a document that doesn't reflect what I found.
You found inconveniences. There's a difference.
The bank needs confirmation before 3 o'clock.
Let me be direct. You leave at 5:20 every single day. You think that earns you the right to block a $400 million deal?
I think the numbers earn me that right.
Quit if you dare.
Meredith Carver had never lost a deal she decided to close. She knew how to read pressure, how to apply it, and how to make the cost of resistance feel greater than the cost of compliance. Owen Barrett said very little. He opened a report to a specific page, asked one question she could not answer, and sat with his hands still while she spoke. That stillness should have told her something. She issued the challenge she believed would end the conversation. What had a man with nothing left to protect already put in motion before she finished speaking? If you've ever been told your boundaries made you less serious about your work, this story is for you. Subscribe and hit the bell. There's a lot more coming that you won't want to miss. Owen Barrett arrived at Cumberland Tower every morning before the building's coffee cart was open. He had been doing it for 4 years, not to impress anyone, not to manufacture the appearance of dedication, but because the hours between 6:45 and 8:30 were the only ones where the 31st floor belonged to him. No meetings. No Bryce stopping by his desk to casually repurpose whatever Owen had built overnight. Just the numbers, the quiet, and the particular kind of thinking that required both. He left every afternoon at 5:20. Not 5:15, not 5:30. 5:20, which gave him 12 minutes to reach the parking structure, 10 minutes to drive to Westside Elementary, and 3 minutes to be standing at the pickup gate before Paige walked out. She was 9 years old and had her mother's way of scanning a crowd quickly, thoroughly, until she found the one face she was looking for. Owen had decided 4 years ago, and without fanfare, that his face would always be the one she found. Mariner Health Capital occupied 4 floors of Cumberland Tower, and its culture had been shaped more than anyone cared to admit by the habits of its CEO. Meredith Carver did not simply work long hours. She treated the length of someone's day as a direct measure of their seriousness, their ambition, their fitness for leadership. A vice president who sent analysis at 1 a.m. was praised in the next all-hands meeting, not for the quality of the analysis, which Meredith rarely examined closely, but for the timestamp. Owen had watched that dynamic play out enough times to understand exactly what it meant for someone like him. How as a director of risk analysis, which meant his job was to find the problems that other people missed. His models had flagged structural irregularities in 3 separate acquisition targets before the company's outside auditors reached the same conclusion. His reports were thorough-sourced and almost always correct. They were also consistently attributed to someone else. Bryce Landon, who oversaw mergers and acquisitions, had developed a habit of presenting Owen's financial models in senior meetings, while introducing their author as the analyst who had assisted with data validation. Owen had corrected this impression once directly, and Bryce had responded by explaining that Owen was a detail person and that detail people should be comfortable staying in the background. Owen had not corrected it again. Natalie Boone had watched the pattern repeat itself since she joined the team 18 months earlier. She was careful in the way that people are when they are still learning which rules matter and which ones are only enforced selectively. She sat close enough to Bryce's office to notice when documents came back from his desk, with language she didn't recognize, softer language, hedged language, language that moved conclusions from the category of warning into the category of routine procedural notes. She noticed, and she kept the observation to herself, the way junior analysts learn to do when they are not yet sure who in a given organization is safe to be honest with. Owen stayed at Mariner because he had reasons more concrete than ambition and more durable than loyalty. Paige needed stability, the particular unglamorous stability of a reliable school district. A health insurance plan that didn't change every year and a father present enough to know her teachers' names. He had told himself more than once that his work would eventually speak clearly enough to overcome the politics around it. He was not entirely wrong about that. He was wrong about the timeline. The Prairie Sky Air Care deal arrived in late October, already carrying the particular momentum of something Meredith had decided she wanted. Prairie Sky operated 18 emergency air medical bases across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas, a network of helicopter rescue services contracted with regional hospitals and county emergency management agencies. The acquisition price was $400 million. Meredith described it in the meeting where she announced the target to senior leadership as the deal that would make Mariner the dominant force in emergency medical transport. Her voice carried the weight of someone talking about their legacy, not just a transaction. The company's pitch materials were impressive. Prairie Sky claimed that 94% of its fleet was mission-ready at any given time, that average dispatch response was under 15 minutes, that all 18 bases held current operating licenses, and that existing contracts with hospitals and local governments would transfer cleanly to the new owner. Revenue projections showed a minimum of 12% annual growth for the following 5 years. Owen read the materials twice, then set them aside and started looking at the underlying data. The first inconsistency was small enough that another analyst might have rounded it into acceptable variance. Prairie Sky's reported flight hours when measured against fuel purchase records didn't balance. If 94% of a fleet is operational and generating the flight activity, Prairie Sky claimed the fuel consumption numbers needed to be at least 28% higher than what the invoices showed. They weren't. Owen pulled the maintenance logs, the aircraft registration records, the pilot scheduling sheets, and the emergency dispatch reports. He worked through them the way he worked through everything methodically, without a conclusion he was trying to reach. What he found was not a rounding error. 5 aircraft listed as active in Prairie Sky's fleet had been sitting in maintenance hangars for months, waiting on engine and rotor inspections that had not yet been completed. 2 more were flying with replacement parts whose serial numbers did not match the maintenance records on file. When Owen calculated the actual deployable capacity of the fleet using only the aircraft he could verify as airworthy, the number came out to approximately 61%, not 94%. He then cross-referenced the emergency dispatch logs and found records of simultaneous flights that Prairie Sky's available aircraft and certified pilots could not have executed. Some of those flights appeared in billing records submitted to insurance carriers. Owen kept going because 1 anomaly generally means nothing, and 3 anomalies generally mean something. He found that 7 of Prairie Sky's aircraft were leased from companies that shared ownership structures with Calvin Stroud, Prairie Sky's founder, at rates significantly above market value. That relationship had not been disclosed anywhere in the acquisition materials. He found that 3 of Prairie Sky's bases had received formal regulatory notices from their respective state aviation authorities, notices about incomplete safety inspections, unverified maintenance documentation, and aircraft operated outside the window of their current airworthiness certificates. Prairie Sky had not disclosed those notices either. The contract issue was in some ways the most consequential. Owen located the underlying agreements between Prairie Sky and the county and municipal emergency services it served, and those contracts contained language that did not allow automatic assignment to a new owner. A change of control triggered a mandatory review process, a new safety evaluation, by the relevant government agencies that could take 6 to 9 months and carried no guarantee of approval. Those local government contracts accounted for nearly 42% of Prairie Sky's total operating revenue. They were a central part of the valuation model. They were also under the terms of the deal as currently structured, something Mariner might not actually be purchasing. Owen wrote a 47-page report. It was precise, sourced, and organized around 4 conditions he designated material adverse: the fleet's true readiness rate of approximately 61%, the licensing exposure at 3 bases, the unresolved transferability of the contracts that generated nearly half the network's value, and the maintenance documentation that showed signs of alteration or fabrication. His conclusion was that the acquisition should not proceed until an independent operational audit had been completed. He sent the report to Bryce, to Janet Phelps in compliance, and to the members of the investment committee. The timestamp on the distribution email was 8 days before the scheduled closing. Bryce called Owen into his office the next morning and told him that his role in the process was to confirm that the risk profile fell within acceptable parameters, not to generate reasons to abandon a deal the CEO had already committed to. Owen explained that he could not confirm a risk profile he did not believe was accurate. Bryce told him to reframe his findings as manageable items to be addressed post-closing. Owen said that several of the items were not manageable post-closing because they might not exist post-closing. Bryce ended the meeting. When Owen saw the version of his report being prepared for the closing meeting, he had to read it twice to fully account for the distance between what he had written and what now carried his name. The charts were the visual architecture of the analysis, the data structure he had built over 3 weeks. But the conclusions had been replaced. The 61% fleet readiness figure had been softened into a note about certain aircraft requiring supplemental maintenance. The regulatory exposure at 3 bases had become a reference to routine license renewal processes. The contract transferability risk had been recharacterized as standard administrative procedure. The section about maintenance documentation with signs of alteration had been removed entirely. Where Owen's report had recommended a halt pending external verification, the revised version recommended proceeding with post-acquisition remediation. At the bottom of the final page, in the line reserved for the reviewing analyst, his name appeared. Owen had not signed that document. He had not agreed to its conclusions. He had not been asked. I went back to Bryce and said exactly that. Bryce told him that his participation in the analysis meant his name was legitimately associated with the process, that this was standard practice, and that the document needed to be signed and returned before noon the following day. If Owen refused, the record would show that he had failed to complete his assigned deliverable on a major transaction. Owen sat with that for a moment. He thought about the school district, the insurance plan, the parking structure, and the 12-minute drive, and the 3 minutes he needed to be standing at the gate. He thought about Paige's face when she came out of the building and looked for him in the crowd. He thought about what it would mean to sign his name to a document that told $400 million worth of investors that there was nothing seriously wrong with a company he knew had 7 aircraft in regulatory limbo and a fleet actually operational at 61%, not 94%. I did not sign. The next morning, Owen was called into the executive conference room on the 31st floor. Meredith was already at the head of the table. Bryce sat to her right. Janet Phelps was across from them, and beside her were 2 members of the investment committee, and Peter Rains, the attorney representing the consortium of banks, providing $275 million of the transaction's total funding. The bank would release those funds only after Mariner formally certified that no undisclosed material adverse conditions existed in the target company. Owen set his original report on the table. He presented his findings for 20 minutes. No one in the room disputed a single figure. What happened next was not a debate about the numbers. Meredith did not argue with 61% or with the regulatory notices or with the contract language about change of control reviews. She asked why Owen had not visited the bases himself over the weekend. He explained his request for field verification had been rejected in writing by Bryce. Meredith moved past that and asked whether someone who left at 5:20 every afternoon had the standing to block a transaction of this magnitude. Owen told her he had arrived 2 hours before most of the floor that morning, as he had every morning, and that the report on the table was the work he had done in that time. He asked the room to look at the content, not the calendar. Meredith picked up the pen from the center of the table and set it in front of him. He did not pick it up. The pen stayed where Meredith had placed it. Owen told the room clearly, and without raising his voice, that the document on the table did not reflect the analysis he had conducted, that his name appeared on it without his approval, that he could not certify Mariner had received complete and accurate due diligence when he knew and could demonstrate that the diligence had been materially altered, and that proceeding to close under these conditions would likely constitute a violation of the disclosure obligations in the bank's term sheet, because the bank was funding $275 million on the explicit assurance that no undisclosed material adverse conditions existed. Peter Rains, the bank's attorney, wrote something on the legal pad in front of him. He did not look up. Meredith told Owen he was attempting to impose his personal interpretation of risk on a decision that belonged to the executive team. Owen asked her for the second time since entering the room whether she could identify a single factual error in his original report. She turned several pages. The room stayed quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone present understands that a question is not going to be answered. Meredith closed the report and said that the issue was not any individual figure, but Owen's inability to contextualize risk within the larger strategic opportunity. Owen said he was willing to contextualize everything in the report, and that the contextualization did not change the 61%. Meredith set the report aside and told Owen that if he lacked the professional fortitude to stand behind a company decision, perhaps he did not belong at the table where those decisions were made. Owen said he was willing to stand behind his work, the 47 pages he had written and sourced and distributed 8 days earlier, but he would not stand behind a document that someone else had rewritten and then attached his name to. The room had the attention of people who understood that something was happening that could not be unhappened. Meredith looked at him and said, "Then quit. Quit if you dare. But don't think a single father with a limited schedule is going to find an equivalent position in this industry." The conference room on the 31st floor of Cumberland Tower was at that moment completely silent. Owen reached up and unclipped his employee badge from his jacket. He set it on the table next to the pen. He said, "I won't teach my daughter that safety is worth more than the truth." Then he walked to the computer at the side. Credenza opened his email and spent 4 minutes composing a message to Janet Phelps and to Elaine Baxter, who chaired Mariner's board of directors. He wrote that he had not approved the revised risk report, that his name could not be used as a certification of its conclusions, that his original report had been distributed to the investment committee 8 days prior, that all versions of the document and their revision histories needed to be preserved, and that the unresolved material conditions he had identified might affect Mariner's disclosure obligations to its lending consortium. He attached the original 47-page report and the complete list of data sources. He did not copy a journalist, a regulator, later a competitor, or anyone outside the company. He sent the message, closed the browser, collected his belongings, and left. Meredith waited approximately 40 seconds after the door closed before she spoke. She told Bryce to have Owen's name removed from the certification document and to find another member of the analysis team who could sign in his place. She wanted everything finalized before 3 o'clock, when Prairie Sky's principals had indicated they would hold the agreed price. Natalie Boone was the person Bryce approached. She was at her desk on the 29th floor, aware that something had shifted in the building's atmosphere. The way junior employees always become aware of such things, through hallway tones and the speed at which doors were opening and closing on the executive level. Bryce told her the certification needed a signatory from the risk analysis function, and that her role was simply to confirm that the internal review process had been completed according to protocol. He was careful to frame it as a procedural matter rather than a substantive one. Natalie asked whether she would be attesting to the accuracy of the conclusions in the document. Bryce said she would be confirming process completion. Natalie said she had not reviewed the underlying data files and could not represent that the analysis was complete without having done so herself. Bryce said that was not what was being asked of her. Natalie said she understood what was being asked of her and that her answer was no. Bryce returned to the 31st floor. Meredith decided to proceed with his signature on the certification document and instructed the legal team to prepare everything for a 3 o'clock execution. Janet Phelps spent the time between 11:45 and 12:30 reading the loan agreement. She had read it before, but she read it again now with the specific attention of someone who knows the section they are looking for. The disclosure covenant in the financing documents was not ambiguous. It required Mariner to notify the lending consortium immediately if any member of the team responsible for due diligence declined to certify a report due to the discovery of a material adverse condition. Owen had been the lead analyst on the acquisition review. He had declined to certify the report. He had stated explicitly in writing that his reason was the presence of material adverse conditions he believed had not been disclosed. Janet was not permitted to withhold that information from the bank. The covenant did not give her discretion. It gave her an obligation. At 12:41 in the afternoon, Janet sent Peter Rains a formal written notification that Mariner's due diligence certification was subject to an unresolved internal dispute that the lead analyst had declined to sign due to identified material conditions, and that the matter had been communicated to the board chair. She attached Owen's email. Peter Rains responded within 11 minutes. He requested access to the original risk report, the version that had been distributed 8 days before the closing meeting, not the version Bryce had signed that morning. Meredith told the legal team to characterize Owen's report as a preliminary working draft that had not been formally submitted for committee consideration. The legal team pulled the distribution records. The email sending Owen's 47-page report to the investment committee showed delivery confirmations for every recipient, including Meredith. A document formally distributed to the full investment committee 8 days before closing was not under any reasonable definition a preliminary working draft. The bank's team reached the same conclusion within the hour. At 12:58, the lending consortium suspended the wire transfer and issued an emergency inquiry to the aviation regulatory authorities in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas. Meredith spent the next hour and 45 minutes attempting to manage the situation through calls to Peter Rains and to the bank's lead relationship officer, arguing that the regulatory matters Owen had identified were either already being addressed or had been overstated by an analyst who lacked the context to evaluate them properly. The relationship officer told her the bank needed to receive responses from the state agencies before it could proceed. At 2:46 in the afternoon, the formal regulatory reply arrived. 7 of Prairie Sky's aircraft were under active suspension of their operating certificates. The suspension had been initiated because maintenance documentation, submitted during a routine audit, could not be independently verified serial numbers on filed records did not match the parts installed on the aircraft. 3 of Prairie Sky's bases had received notices of temporary operational restriction the previous week following the discovery that 2 aircraft had been dispatched while their airworthiness certificates were outside their valid period. Prairie Sky had not notified Mariner of any of these actions. The local government emergency services contracts, representing nearly 42% of Prairie Sky's revenue, were subject to a mandatory safety reevaluation process before they could be assigned to a new owner, a timeline of 6 to 9 months with no guaranteed outcome. At 3:12, the lending consortium formally withdrew its $275 million financing commitment. Owen was sitting outside Westside Elementary when Paige came through the gate. At 3:23, she scanned the pickup line in that quick, thorough way she had her mother's way and found his car. She raised one hand. Owen raised one back and held his expression steady until she pulled open the door and climbed in. She asked him if anything interesting happened today. He told her it had been a complicated afternoon. She said complicated usually meant something interesting happened, and he just wasn't ready to talk about it yet. He told her that was probably right. She accepted this with the particular patience of a child who has learned that her father will get there eventually, and turned to look out the window at the afternoon going past. At 3:27, Calvin Stroud's attorney sent a termination notice declaring Mariner in breach of the closing timeline. Owen's phone showed a message from Natalie shortly after 3 sentences, no commentary, just the facts. Stroud had pulled out, the bank had already withdrawn, the deal was finished. Owen read it twice, then set the phone face down on the passenger seat. He knew what the next version of events would sound like. He had watched Meredith manage narratives long enough to know her grammar for it. An analyst had panicked. A mid-level employee with a personal grievance had destabilized a deal that was otherwise on track. The schedule he kept for Paige would become evidence of his limited commitment. His refusal to sign would become insubordination. His email to the board chair would become a breach of confidentiality or an attempt at sabotage, or both, depending on which version landed better with the people she needed to convince. He thought about what it would cost to defend himself against that narrative. He did not have a lawyer on retainer. He did not have a savings cushion deep enough to absorb a lawsuit while he searched for another position. What he did have was a time-stamped email, a 47-page report with a full distribution record, a revision history he had not yet seen but suspected Natalie had already preserved, and the regulatory response that had just confirmed every number he had written. The truth had a paper trail. He had made sure of it before he walked out of the building. It did not make the drive home feel any less like crossing uncertain ground. Meanwhile, on the 31st floor of Cumberland Tower, Meredith was on a call with the board of directors. She told them that Owen had acted in bad faith, that he had submitted an unauthorized document designed to alarm the bank rather than inform it, and that his refusal to participate in the closing process was driven by personal resentment over being passed over for advancement. She characterized his departure as an emotional decision made under professional pressure and recommended that Mariner pursue him for breach of confidentiality obligations. She framed every action he had taken as the behavior of a disgruntled employee who had chosen his personal agenda over his professional responsibilities. She did not mention the 61%. She did not mention the 7 suspended aircraft, or the regulatory notices at 3 bases, or the contract transferability clause, or the maintenance records with serial numbers that didn't match. She did not mention that she had received Owen's report 8 days before the closing and had chosen to proceed anyway. In the version she was presenting, Owen Barrett was the reason the deal had failed, not the falsified logs, not the undisclosed regulatory actions, not a fleet operational at 61%, while its owner told investors it was operational at 94%. She believed with the settled confidence of someone who had rewritten inconvenient facts before and found the rewrites accepted that this version would hold. Elaine Baxter had chaired Mariner's board of directors for 11 years, which meant she had sat through enough crisis meetings To know the difference between a room full of people trying to understand what happened and a room full of people trying to manage what gets said about what happened. The emergency session she convened the morning after the Prairie Sky collapse was within its first 10 minutes, clearly the latter, or at least that was what Meredith intended it to be. Owen had been invited to attend. The formal language of the invitation described it as an opportunity to respond to concerns raised by senior leadership regarding his conduct during the closing process. He understood what that meant. He came anyway, and he did not come with a prepared statement or a rehearsed account of his motivations. He came with a folder. Inside it was the original 47-page report with its distribution email. There was the written request he had submitted to Bryce, asking for a 10-day extension to conduct field verification, and Bryce's written response, declining the request on the grounds that the timeline could not be adjusted. There was the revision history of the certification document exported from Mariner's internal document management system, which Natalie had preserved before anyone thought to restrict access. There was the certification page bearing Owen's name above a signature line that was blank. There was the email Owen had sent to Janet and Elaine the morning of the closing. And there was a single-page spreadsheet, clean-sourced annotated, that showing the fleet calculation that produced the 61% figure. Elaine opened the session by asking Meredith to present her account of the previous day's events. Meredith did so with the fluency of someone who had refined the narrative overnight. Owen had acted unilaterally. He had submitted an unsanctioned document to the investment committee without executive approval. When asked to align with the team's conclusions, he had refused and walked out of the closing meeting, triggering a chain of events that caused the bank to withdraw its commitment. His behavior, she said, reflected a pattern of difficulty with collaborative decision-making, and his decision to copy the board chair on an internal dispute represented a serious breach of professional conduct. Elaine listened to all of it. Then she asked Owen to present his account. Owen did not characterize anyone's behavior or offer a competing narrative. He laid the documents on this table in chronological order and walked through them the way he walked through every analysis in sequence, one fact at a time. He showed the distribution email that proved his report had been formally submitted to the investment committee 8 days before closing. He showed Bryce's written refusal of his field verification request, which established that the gap in Owen's due diligence had been created by the company, not by him. Then he showed the revision history. Natalie was in the room. She had been asked by Elaine's office to appear, not by Meredith's, and she presented the revision history documentation with the same careful precision she brought to everything she did. The history showed that Bryce had accessed the certification document 4 days before closing and made 14 distinct changes. Those changes included the deletion of the 61% fleet readiness figure, the removal of the 3 base licensing exposure section, the elimination of all references to the maintenance documentation, irregularities, the replacement of the contract transferability warning with a phrase about standard administrative procedures, and the substitution of the original conclusion, which recommended halting the transaction pending external audit, with a recommendation to proceed. Owen's name had remained on the document through all 14 revisions. His approval had not been sought for any of them. Bryce said that what he had done was simplify a technical document for a non-technical audience, that this was a normal part of the preparation process for board-level materials, and that Owen's original report had contained analytical judgments that exceeded the scope of a risk review. Elaine asked Bryce why simplifying a document for a non-technical audience required removing the number 61%, which was not a technical concept, but a quantity that any reader could evaluate without specialized knowledge. Bryce did not produce an answer that satisfied anyone in the room, including from his expression himself. Meredith returned to her argument that Owen had displayed a pattern of prioritizing personal caution over organizational momentum, and that no acquisition of this complexity was without manageable risk, and that the role of leadership was to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information, rather than waiting for certainty that would never arrive. Elaine let her finish. Then she picked up the original report, turned to the executive summary page, and asked Meredith a question she had clearly spent time deciding how to frame. She asked whether Prairie Sky's fleet had been operationally ready at 94% on the day Mariner signed the letter of intent. Meredith said the question required context. Elaine asked whether 7 of Prairie Sky's aircraft had been under active suspension of their operating certificates at the time of the scheduled closing. Meredith said she had not been fully informed of the regulatory situation. Elaine placed in front of her the email confirming she had received Owen's 47-page report, the one identifying 7 aircraft under regulatory review, 3 bases, with licensing exposure and maintenance records with serial number discrepancies 8 days before the closing date. She asked whether receiving that document constituted being fully informed. The room was quiet in a way that was different from the silence in the closing meeting the day before. That silence had been tense, pressurized, full of people calculating their exposure. This silence was the kind that comes after a question finds the center of something, and no one has anywhere useful to go. Elaine set the email down and spoke to the room rather than to any individual in it. She said the board needed to determine whether the Prairie Sky transaction had failed because an analyst had disrupted a sound process, or because a sound analyst had been pressured to conceal a flawed one. She said the documentation in front of them answered that question, and that the board would be proceeding accordingly. The formal findings took 3 days. The board concluded that Owen had fulfilled his professional obligations completely and accurately. His report had correctly identified material adverse conditions. He had not disclosed any information to parties outside the company. The bank's inquiry had been triggered by Janet's compliance notification, which was itself required under the terms of the loan agreement. The revised certification document had been altered without Owen's knowledge or consent, and his name had been retained on it after the alterations were made. Meredith had received full written notice of the material conditions Owen identified, and had chosen to proceed to closing without addressing them or disclosing them to the lending consortium. Bryce had made substantive changes to a due diligence document and submitted it under a name that had not authorized those changes. Meredith was suspended the same afternoon the findings were issued. The independent investigation that followed lasted 6 weeks. At the end of it, she was terminated for cause, specifically for deliberately concealing material adverse information from Mariner's financing partners, and for directing a subordinate to certify a document that had been altered without the certifying analyst's knowledge or consent. Bryce's employment was ended the same day for falsifying due diligence records and misrepresenting the authorship of a material financial document. Mariner's new leadership self reported the matter to the bank and to the relevant investment oversight bodies, accompanied by a complete record of the revision history, the original report, and the full timeline of communications. The company also enacted a set of internal policies that were in their specificity a precise map of what had gone wrong. No employee's name could appear on a document as a reviewer or certifying analyst unless that employee had approved the final version. All substantive revisions to due diligence materials had to be logged in version control with the editor's identity attached. Any analyst who identified a material adverse condition had the right to present that finding directly to the board without passing through the deal team. Performance evaluations could not use physical presence at the office as a proxy for professional commitment, and family responsibilities could not be referenced in any assessment of an employee's leadership potential or career trajectory. The board sent Owen a formal letter confirming that he had engaged in no professional misconduct. Shortly after, Elaine called him directly. She told him the board wanted him back, a senior position, in a newly structured risk governance function, compensation, materially above what he had been earning, and a seat at the table where investment decisions were made. She said Mariner was a different organization than it had been 2 months earlier, and that she believed that. Owen told her he appreciated the call and the letter, and did not doubt that the organization had changed. What he said next was not unkind, but it was clear a new title could not repair the fact that Mariner had needed to lose $400 million before it was willing to hear what he had been saying for 3 weeks. He wished her well with the work ahead. Elaine did not argue. She said she hoped he would land somewhere that deserved him. Owen said he intended to build it himself. The first several months after leaving Mariner, Owen consulted independently for a regional hospital network, evaluating the operational claims of a transport services vendor. The work took 3 weeks. His findings saved the hospital system from entering a contract with a vendor whose equipment compliance rate was closer to 58% than the 89% the vendor had represented. The hospital's procurement director asked who else he had done this kind of work for. Owen told her he was building that list. She asked to be kept informed. Ledger Point Advisory opened its doors 14 months after Owen left Cumberland Tower, a suite on the 4th floor of a building 8 blocks away. The name came from an accounting concept. A ledger point is the moment in an audit when the numbers either reconcile or they don't, and everything that follows depends on which one it is. Owen thought that was an accurate description of what he intended to do. Natalie joined as his second hire. She had left Mariner 2 weeks after the board findings were issued, not because she had been asked to leave, but because she had decided that she wanted to work somewhere. The outcome for being right was not 18 months of professional uncertainty. The practice grew without significant marketing. The clients who found Ledger Point were almost without exception organizations that had already paid the cost of ignoring a risk analyst procurement teams that had watched a vendor relationship collapse because someone had pressured the due diligence process investment committees that had approved acquisitions based on materials that turned out to have been selectively presented. Those clients did not need to be convinced that accurate risk analysis was worth paying for. They had recently learned at considerable expense exactly what it was worth. One afternoon, Owen was working through a set of maintenance records for a client evaluating an air medical transport acquisition when he noticed that the analyst across the office, a woman named Diane who had joined Ledger Point 4 months earlier, had been checking her phone every few minutes for the better part of an hour. He looked up and asked her what was going on. She said she had a parent-teacher conference at 4:30 that she hadn't mentioned because she hadn't finished the client presentation she was supposed to deliver in the morning. She said it in the way people say things when they have already decided they are going to skip the thing they actually need to do in order to perform the thing they feel obligated to complete. Owen closed the folder on his desk. He told her the presentation could be finished in the morning, that he would come in early if she needed another set of eyes on it, and that her son would remember whether she was at that conference long after the client had forgotten whether the deck arrived at 8 in the morning or 9:30. Diane gathered her things and left. Owen looked at the clock, 5:17, closed his own laptop, and drove to pick up Paige. Meredith had once told a roomful of people that a leader who left at 5:20 every day was not someone who could be trusted with the company's most consequential decisions. What she had not understood was that knowing what you will not sacrifice is not a limitation. It is the thing that makes everything else trustworthy. The deal had not collapsed because Owen refused to sign. It had collapsed because Prairie Sky's fleet was operational at 61%, while its owner told investors it was operational at 94%, and because Meredith Carver believed that her authority over the people in a room could extend to authority over what the numbers in that room were allowed to mean. Numbers do not negotiate. Owen had known that for a long time. If Owen's story stayed with you, the part about knowing what you won't sacrifice, and how that's not a weakness, but the thing that makes everything else solid, then you already understand the point of this channel. We tell stories about people who held the line when it cost them something. If that's the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell us about a time you chose truth over comfort. We read every one.